Rocky Nook, are you haunted by a sea witch? Good evening and welcome to tonight's story. I'm titling it Rachel's Rock. Joseph R. Chandler, the author, just titled it Number 2. So it's the story of a sea witch and a curse that she puts on some pirates here in Plymouth. The deceived themselves often contribute more than the deceiver to their own delusions. The good people of the old colony have always been influenced by the predictions of some old witch who pretended to peep into fate through the bottom of a teacup and discern the movements of the heavens by the settling of her coffee grounds. One such old woman had for many years inhabited a hovel which had once been used as a fish house. It was situated near the extremity of a small promontory which overhung the center of Plymouth Bay. The ease with which she could gather her supper from the shores and nearby lakes had probably induced her to take up residence in such a dreary place. Also, the profit she derived from predicting fair winds and favorable weather did much towards gaining the affection of the owner of her habitation. For so long and so successfully had Rachel foretold to inquiring seamen the weather of the coming day, though any who live along the seaboard know how easy this is an art to acquire, that they almost felt she had influence over her own predictions. Not one was known to calculate a voyage into the outer bay without consulting Aunt Rach about the morrow's weather, nor on their return did they neglect to leave her a portion of their takings as a reward for she who had perhaps secured their success. There were some in the village who ridiculed Rachel's talents and would sneer at those who were influenced by her predictions. But it was said that even those who were respected as the minister, the schoolmaster, and the physician were always able to find an excuse for delaying an expedition that Rachel might have pronounced against. And I myself recollect when a certain church leader neglected its counsel because of the domineering boldness of this prophetess of the storm. Rachel found great pleasure in the solitude of the night. Her neighbors often took note of her with awe as she contemplated the flux of the sea in the moonlight. She was met on one of her midnight rambles by a party preparing for an early departure for the outer bay fishing, who anxiously inquired about the morrow's weather. Fair, sees neither rain nor wind. The minister must have less corn in his own field to make prayers available. But Aunt Rach, do you see that cloud to the west? They always put the last syllable to her name when they spoke to her at night. What have I to do with west or south? I have promised fair, though you might have chosen a better day than Friday, considering you make but one voyage a year. Just then a large vessel hove into sight. By the pale light of the moon, it was impossible to distinguish the class to which she belonged. She will come in, and for no good. We do not hear the sound of church bells at midnight for nothing, said Rachel. But that was Plymouth's clock striking 12, said one of the company. Do we hear clocks 4 miles against the wind? And Plymouth clock, too? A wooden rattle with scarcely more work on it than that windlass of yonder tobacco boat, said Rachel. Before the party had prepared for their departure, the vessel, a large brig, had come to and anchored near the shore. The vessel, owned in that place and loaded with sugar by a Boston merchant, had put into the harbor for some minor repairs to her spars. Only one of the crew was a native to the village, and the next day conducted his messmates to Rachel's shack to inquire into the prospects of their voyage. As the party crossed the threshold, the prophetess said to her townsman, "John Burgess, have you done well entering the Betsy? The poor man's curse is on her. Think you the vessel paid for in exchange notes will make a voyage?" The sailor interrupted, "But Aunt Rachel, we did not build her." "If you would not have her fortune, flee her company. And is it for this, John?" Is it for this your father the deacon has prayed, that your mother has wept, that the blessing of the minister was given to your departure? To be found with wretches like these? Land sharks, moon cursers! Avast there, old Grana, said one of the strangers. Give us none of your slack, or we will put a stopper upon your gob. A beam of fire seemed to flash from the old woman's eyes as she rose from her bench and threw down the coarse table on which she had been leaning. You are known, said she, that there's not a mother's son of you that was not swaddled in the ruins of a wreck. Damned hag, said the oldest. But interruption was vain. The worst feelings of Rachel were roused, and her most painful recollection excited, and her tongue expressed the intensity of her feelings. There's not a moon curser of you all that has not braved a nor'easter to fix a light upon a pole to mislead a pilot and wreck his ship for the plundering, when you would not wet a foot to save a seaman's life. And who? You children of devils incarnate, who but your father and mothers fastened the lantern to a horse's head, and this in a storm, wrecked the brig upon your cursed sands, that left me childless and a widow. May he who rides upon the pale horse be your guide, and you be of the number who will follow with him. The last malediction scarcely reached the object of her curse. They went to the vessel and meditated a revenge, every way worth of the conduct that Rachel had charged them with. The next night, at about 10 o'clock, the village was alarmed by a strong light at or near the wharf. In less than 20 minutes, every inhabitant but the infant and the decrepit was at the place, and Rachel, half wrapped in the remains of an old sail, which served as a bed curtain, was seen rushing from the burning hovel. No language could do justice to the looks and gestures of this infuriated wretch. She ran round the scene of conflagration with the actions of a fury, howling her curses upon the cause of her new calamity. Her gray hair flying in the winds as she stood between the strong light of the blaze and the spectators. Its upturned points seemed tipped with living flame. The next morning the brig prepared for sailing, and many of the inhabitants, either to see the ruins of Rachel's hut or to watch the vessel's departure, flocked to the wharf, although it was a Sunday. The brig got under way with a fine wind against the tide, and as she made her way smoothly down the channel, the attention of the spectators was invited by Rachel. She had seated herself upon a rock, which elevated its top considerably above the waves, although it was entirely surrounded by the tide. The hollow moan which she uttered was lost in the rushing of the waves upon the pebbly shore, and indeed she had scarcely been noticed in the bustle of preparing the vessel, when she was observed. The owner of the vessel attempted to offer her some consolation for the loss of her house. She replied without once withdrawing her eyes from the receding vessel. You need not comfort me. Every barn could give me shelter if I should need it. But in 3 days I shall be tenanted in the narrow house which yonder wretches cannot burn. But you, who shall console you for the loss of yon brig? Think you that she can swim loaded with curses of the poor, with my curses, which have never been in vain? She has passed Brown's Island, said the owner, evidently affected by the vehemence of her manner, and that is the worst shoal in the bay. Rachel grew more furious as the brig passed in safety any point or shoal which was considered particularly dangerous, and as the breeze freshened, her matted hair floated out like streamers upon the wind, and her long bony arms were extended with cursing gestures, and she appeared as she poured out her maledictions upon the authors of her calamities, like the evil spirit of the ocean, chiding forth the storms as ministers of her vengeance. When the vessel had passed Beach Point, the last obstruction to navigation in the harbor, and forming the extreme southern cape, which protected the whole bay, the owner turned to the old woman, and again offered to console her for the loss of her house, and even tendered the use of another habitation. But she was raving in all the impotence of disappointed madness. Her voice was inarticulate. She foamed at the mouth. and howled the most demonic accents. Her face and swollen eyes that seemed almost starting from their sockets were bent upon the single object of her curses, when suddenly her voice ceased, and she leaned forward in the very ecstasy of expectation. The eyes of the company following her gaze were fixed upon the brig. Her sails were shivering in the wind, and all seemed hurry and confusion upon her decks. In a few moments she slowly sunk from the view of the spectators, and nothing of her was to be seen but a part of her top-gallant mast standing above the waves. Rachel pitched forward into the water as she saw the vessel sink, and as the people were engaged in preparing boats to go to the vessel, she died unnoticed. The brig, which had struck upon a sunken and unknown rock, was afterwards raised with the loss of nearly all her cargo and one man, the very one, it is said, who had put fire to the house. The body of Rachel was found and buried on the spot where her house had stood. The rock on which the vessel struck is now called Rachel's Curse, and the grave on the promontory serves to this day as a landmark for the channel. Whew! That was intense. Give me a minute. So I'm back. I might have overdone that one part, but it's pretty hard not to get into it when you're reading dialogue like that. So the truth behind the story. My big question when I was reading this was where was Rachel's house? And the whole time I'm picturing Highcliffe, because that seemed like the only place with a cliff overhanging the bay, the center of the bay. And I went there and I recorded, but something was bothering me about that, because in the story he says they are 4 miles from Plymouth Clock. And I'm guessing Plymouth Clock was on Leyden Street. I don't know. Because this story probably took place sometime between 1800 and 1815. Because Joseph Chandler puts himself into the story at one point and said he himself knew of an incident. So he had to have been around during this story, is how I'm taking that. So that's why I'm placing the story somewhere between 1800 and 1815. So Highcliffe, no, it's not the right distance, but I was thinking, well, maybe they just didn't have good measurement back then, but it didn't seem right to me. So I was thinking about Joseph R. Chandler and all his stories and where he lived, and it suddenly dawned on me. Rocky Nook. I really feel like Rachel lived in Rocky Nook, because Rocky Nook actually happens to be exactly 4 miles to Leyden Street. And it just fits the description the more you think of it. So I didn't record anything there because it's just people's houses, but if you're ever driving along Shore Drive, you can be thinking about Rachel and her house. I did go down to Grays Beach and record in that direction, but you can't really see. I'm not sure what rock she would have been sitting on in the water because I couldn't really see around. But I'd like to. And what I'd really like to know is if you live in Rocky Nook, have you ever had any hauntings by an old woman? Because what happened to her grave? If Rachel was real, and I really think she was real, she was buried there. Did they move her grave, or is she still buried there? Is someone's house on top of her grave? Or is she in someone's yard and they don't even know it? So I'd really like to know if she's haunting the area. It's really interesting. And so one of the reasons why I really think this story is true, in some sense, is because I found another version of it. This one, though, was published in 1860, and it's very similar, but there could have been several things going on here with this other story, and I only just found it, so I haven't done that much with it. So it could either be another version of the story because it's been passed down, or it's someone plagiarizing Chandler's story, or it's someone getting back at Chandler with their own version of the story. And I'm kind of leaning towards that idea because in this other version of the story, Rachel is just a beautiful older woman. And they go into a lot of detail about how she had this beautiful raven hair for her age that was wrapped in braids around her head. And some might have called her a witch, but she was nothing like the gray-haired woman whose hair whips in the wind when you think of witch. So it's kind of like the author was getting back at Chandler's description. And then in the 1860 version, the ship's owner is a very greedy man, and Rachel actually almost drowns him, but saves him at the last minute because she's really such a good person, and she stays by his bedside and nurses him back to health and gives up magic and witchcraft. Yeah, so I really think this person either knew Rachel or was related to Rachel in some way, which makes me think there really was a Rachel. But this story, yeah, it's like bad fan fiction with like a really sappy love story. They are not Joseph R. Chandler, this author. His revenge in getting back at Chandler didn't really work, I'd say, because the story was pretty bad. But that's interesting. I'm definitely going to be looking more into that and trying to figure out who this author was. And maybe I can figure out who exactly Rachel was. And they give names, but I don't know if they're actual names in this other version of the story. So I also looked up the Betsy, which is the name of the ship. There was a Betsy built in Boston in the 1780s, which fits with the story, and it was a privateer, which is a legalized pirate, which is what these people were in the story. So that does fit. I just don't know what became of the Betsy, or who her owner was, if they have any ties to Plymouth or Kingston. I just had that little bit of information. I looked on maps to see if there was a rock called Rachel's Curse out in the bay. I couldn't find any old maps with that. Maybe it's just like a nickname. If you know anything about that, I'd also really love to know more about that. I couldn't find anything about any shipwrecks of the Betsy in Plymouth Bay. Still looking, still researching all of that. And I'd like to find out about this other shipwreck that caused Rachel to be a widow, where someone tied a lantern to a... That's a very specific story. Someone tying a lantern to a horse's head to cause a shipwreck. That's interesting. I'd love to know more about that. Maybe I won't be able to. Oh, and a moon curser is a privateer, a legal pirate. When I first read the story, I thought it was like a werewolf or something. She keeps saying moon curser, and I'm like, there's werewolves in this story. No, it's not as exciting as it sounds. There was a lot of ship lingo in this one, which was kind of difficult. Couldn't find anything about John Burgess. There were, so in the story, his name is spelled Burgis, which was a spelling of some Burgesses in the area. But his father was a deacon. Trying to find out if there was a deacon by the name of Burgess. There was a John Burgess also in the 1860 version, so I don't know if that's the actual name, or like I said, the person's just copying Chandler's story. But that's interesting that it was the same name, and Rachel was Rachel in that story. Alright, so that's all I have for now. I'm thinking I should, like, make a book about all these stories. and the truth behind them. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with that. So next week for Halloween weekend, the story is going to be The Spirit Pasture. I'm so excited. That is my favorite story of Joseph R. Chandler's. It's really good. It's really spooky. So make sure you check back next week. Subscribe so you don't miss a video. I do have a couple more stories by him. So I might just continue on past Halloween just to finish some off. I don't know. There's 2 more, I think. But I'm not sure. I might save them for another time, or I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do, because they're not quite like the others. They're very atmospheric, interesting stories. But, like, I couldn't do the truth behind them because there's not enough detail in that sense. But we'll see. We'll see. I don't know what I'm going to do with them yet. So anyways, I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.